So I'm happy with my form behavior here, or with the behavior of this input, but there's one thing which we must not forget. This is one input of an overall form, and in this case, of course, it's the only input. But often you would have more than one input, as we're also soon going to see in the basic form JavaScript file. And for such scenarios, of course, it would be good if we also could find out if the overall form is valid. In the one input case, the overall form is always valid if the one input is valid. But if it's a form with multiple inputs, that's of course not the case. Then 3 of 4 inputs might be valid, 1 input might be invalid, and the overall form then also would be invalid. Because the overall form is only valid if all form inputs are valid. And as soon as at least one form input is invalid, the overall form is invalid. And that's therefore something we should take into account and also incorporate into our logic. But how can we do that now? Well, here's one way of doing that. We can add a new state, which is form is valid, and it has a set form is valid state updating function. And initially that's false, because initially that form isn't valid. Now I want to update this overall form is valid updating function whenever one of the form inputs changes. And for that we could again use useEffect. So I'll bring back that import, and I'll then add a useEffect call here below those two constants here. And in this useEffect call here, I want to set the overall form validity. For this, I'm interested in the validity of my form inputs, and hence I'll add all the form input validities I have in this form here. So for example, the entered name is valid, constant. If we had 2 form inputs here, we would have another constant. For example, for the entered age is valid. And then I would enter entered age as is valid as another dependency here. But we don't have that here, hence it's only one entry. Now that's the dependency of useEffect, and as you learned, whenever the value in such a dependency changes, this effect runs again. And it also runs for the very first time this component is evaluated. So in this useEffect call, I then basically want to combine all my dependencies and check if they are all valid, and if they are, I want to set the overall form to valid. So here I'll check if entered name is valid, and I would add other validities if we had them, like entered age is valid, and check if that's true as well, but we don't have that here. And if it is valid, then I'll set my overall form as valid. Else, if at least one of my inputs is invalid, I'll set my overall form to invalid. So I'll set form is valid to false. And then we could use this value as well. For example, if we wanted to disable this button. Here we could set disabled equal to not form is valid. So the button is disabled if the form is not valid. Now for this, I'll quickly add a style for this. So on the button here, I'll just set a disabled style, which also should apply if the button is then hovered or set as active. And I'll simply add a background color of a light gray here, and a text color of a slightly darker gray, like this, and a border color of that light gray as well. And I'll set the cursor to not allowed. But that's just some CSS styling for this. With that added though, and with disabled being set, you see this button is disabled at the start. It also stays disabled, but if I enter at least one valid character, it becomes enabled. If I invalidate again, it's now disabled again. Now also the form can't even be submitted anymore if it's invalid. Now it's up to you whether you want to disable the button or not. You'll find opinions in both directions out there in the web. There are also people which argue that you should allow your users to submit an invalid form, to not restrict them without them knowing what they have to enter, but that is up to you. I just want to show you how you could build something like this and how you could manage the overall form validity in addition to the validity of the individual inputs, because that can also matter. Of course, if we take a closer look at this useEffect function here, though, we don't even need useEffect. We're not performing any side effect in there. We're doing nothing that would be a problem if we would do it without using useEffect. All we're doing is deriving a new value, just as we're already doing it in lines 7 and 8 with entered name is valid and name input is invalid. So we're basically doing the same here, just for deriving the overall form validity. And of course, there is no reason to use useEffect here for that. We can, but it really doesn't add anything. It just adds extra component re-evaluation cycles. And that's of course not an advantage. Instead, we can get rid of that form is valid state, and we can get rid of useEffect and just check if entered name is valid and any other properties we might have here, like a entered age if we had that. And then we simply add a new variable here, form is valid, which by default is false, let's say, which we then set to true here in this if case, and which we set to false here in the else case. And actually, we don't even need the else case now, because that is our default. And we only override this with true if all our input states are valid. So this again allows us to slim this down even further. And I'm showing this because thinking about possibilities like this is also worth it and is a good thing to do, because it allows you to write slimmer code and maybe even more performant code. So with that, we still got the same behavior as before, but now with less code. So, as mentioned at the end of last lecture, we have a working code here, but we have a lot of duplication. We're not duplicating the exact same words. These constants are named differently. This logic here is different. But the overall logic, the overall structure is of course exactly the same. And if we think about a more complex form like this one, which actually isn't too complex, but which has at least 3 inputs, then we would be repeating that same structure, that same code in the end, 3 times. And that's not what we want to do. So instead, we typically want to outsource some logic somewhere. We don't want to retype and repeat it all the time. And how can we best do that? You could consider creating a separate input component so that you replace this code down there with the input component, and inside of that input component, you then have that logic for validating it, for checking its touch status, and so on. And that would probably work. That is something you could do. The only thing that could become a bit more tricky then, or where you would need to find a solution, would be for managing the overall form validity. Because if you manage every input as an individual closed thing, and you know if the input is valid or not, you then also need a way of letting the overall form know if it's valid or not. And that could certainly be done with props and passing functions to props and calling them from inside the input component and so on. But there also is another approach which I tend to prefer here. And that would be a custom hook. We can use a custom hook to manage all that state logic in there. And let me show you how we could do that. For this, I'll add a new folder in this project here. I'll name it hooks next to components. And I'll then add a useinput.js file because it will be a hook for managing the state and the logic for an input. So in here, I'll add my useinput hook function, and I will export it as a default here. And now in this hook function, I want to manage the value of a given input, the touched state. I want to infer its validity, also combined, of course, with the touched state. Now, of course, this hook should then also be flexible, though. The concrete validation logic should be passed into the hook from outside. But that is something we can build. And I'll start by copying the entered name and entered name touched states here and add them in the useInput function. For this, of course, here in this useInput.js file, we need to import useState from React. Then I'll rename this here to entered value and set entered value to make it more generic. And that here is touched and set is touched. Now, as a next step, we can copy our inferred state here, so to say. So these two constants, entered name is valid and name input is invalid. I'll copy those and also give those better names. I'll name the first one value is valid, and the second one could get a name of has error, because in the end here we control whether an error should be shown or not. Now for value is valid, I check the entered value here, and for has error, I then use value is valid, and if it's not valid, combined with is touched, I find out whether we want to show an error or not. Now this validation logic, however, shouldn't be hard-coded here. Instead, I want to get the logic for that from outside, where this hook gets used. But that's no problem. We can expect a function as an argument to this custom hook function. Let's say the validate value function. So I expect that this parameter receives a function as a value. So that here, for value is valid, I can execute validate value and just pass in the entered value we currently have. And then this hook could return something. It could return an object, could also be an array, but one of the two because I want to return more than one thing. And in this object, I'll return the value, which is the entered value. I'll return has error, which holds the result stored in has error. And since we got the same names here, we can use the modern JavaScript syntax of just listing this once, and it'll automatically be expanded to this here behind the scenes. And we will also need a way of letting the component that uses this hook set the entered value and set the touched state thereafter. Now, for that, we could go back to simple input and copy the name input change handler into useInput as a function, and copy the name input blur handler into our hook function. And rename the functions to value change handler and call set entered value here. And then also input blur handler and call set is touched here. And when we return, I want to expose those functions. So I'll expose the value change handler and the input blur handler, so that these functions, which are defined in the hook, can be called from the place where the hook is being used. So can be called from the component that uses that hook. Now with that, we can use this custom hook in the simple input component. There, we can now import useInput from, going up one level, hooks useInput, and then call useInput here, and then extract values from the result returned by useInput. UseInput returns such an object, hence we can use object destructuring to pull out those keys from that returned object and store the values in brand new constants. So we can, for example, extract the value and then also assign an alias with the colon here and name this entered name, and also pull out the has error state and maybe name this name input has error. Those aliases, of course, are up to you. And also extract the value change handler and give this an alias of name changed handler, and get access to the input blur handler and give it an alias of name blur handler, or something like this. So that this is how we use the hook. But we also need to pass a value into the hook, and that's this validate value function which we call here. So for this, we could define an inline function here where we get some value and then return the result of calling trim on that value and comparing it with an empty string. So the logic we have down there, just with value instead of entered name. Now this is an anonymous arrow function, which is not executed here, but defined here in line, which is then passed to use input. So it's received on this validate value parameter. And then this function here, which we define here, is actually executed in this line here. That's where it's being called. And the entered value, which is this state we're managing here, is the value passed into this function. Can be a bit tricky to wrap your head around, but in the end, it's just regular JavaScript where we are passing a function as a value to another function. And with that, we can customize the validation logic in the component where we need this hook and still execute it inside of the hook. And that now allows us to get rid of these two state slices here for the entered name. It allows us to get rid of these two constants here. Entered name is valid and name input is invalid. And instead use these pulled out constants here. And for example, here we are then actually missing information about the validity. We know if there is an error or not, but that's not just the validity, but the validity combined with the touched state. And therefore, to expose just the validity of an input to the component, I will actually also return value is valid here. Maybe on a is valid key, so that we also expose that information from the hook to the component where we use it. And then in the component, we can also extract is valid and store this in a entered name is valid constant by assigning this alias. And then entered name is valid can be used here again. Now we can get rid of the name input change handler function here and of the name input blur handler. And instead we'll use the name changed handler and the name blur handler, which we're getting out of the hook. So down there in JSX, I connect the name change handler and the name blur handler. Here, instead of using name input is invalid, I will use name has error, name input has error, which we're also getting from the custom hook. And then here, for the form submission handler, where I want to change the touched status and where I want to reset the form, we can get rid of this line of code because the form can't be submitted if the inputs are invalid anyways. So we don't need to mark the inputs as touched here. But of course, we want to be able to reset the form, and therefore we can go back to the custom hook and add a third function here, a reset function, where we simply call set entered value and set this to an empty string, and set is touched and set this to false. And then we just need to expose that so that we also return the reset function as a value in a reset key in that overall returned object. And in simple input.js, we can then get access to this reset function and maybe name it reset name input, give it this alias. And in the form submission handler, we can then just call reset name input here. Now down there, where we infer the CSS classes, I now want to use the name input has error data piece, which we get from the hook. And with that, if we reload, this name behaves just like before. And the overall form also behaves just like before. If I enter something valid here, we can submit it. If this is invalid, we can't. If I reload, if I click in there and out of there, it's invalid. This all works like before. but now with a custom hook. And now we can therefore also replace the email state, the entered email state, with our custom hook. Feel free to try this on your own. We're going to do it together in the next lecture.